Chapter 2 PowerPoint is another review of basic math and its multiplication and division of decimals. You will learn to define the product, the numerator and denominator, multiply and divide decimal fractions, simplify common fractions containing decimal numbers, reduce fractions using common denominators, reduce common fractions that end in zero, express answers to the nearest tenth and 100th and using a calculator to multiply and divide. In multiplying decimals, instead of lining the decimals up, they don't have to be lined up, but we do have to count the total number of decimal points in the fractions that are being multiplied. And we'll see an example of that. So if we multiply the number 0.35 times 0.5, you notice that the decimal points are not lined up. You multiply the number out, and because there are 3 total decimal places, then in the final product we're going to move it over 3 places for a correct answer. Sometimes your product, which the product is the answer that you come up with when you multiply fractions, sometimes there's not a sufficient number of numbers to correctly place the decimal point. In that case, we have to add zeros. Here is an example of that. If we're going to multiply 0.6 times 1.5, we come up with 0090, and we have to do 3 decimal places, and so we add the 0 in front of the 9, put our decimal place there, and then we get rid of this trailing 0 for an answer of 0.09. Division of decimal fractions, you can use the calculator almost always. If you're solving it manually, then there will be some steps that you have to take to make the final division easier. We usually get rid of our decimals. Okay, so let's review terminology. Y'all remember from way back when, a numerator is going to be your top number. Denominator is your bottom number. If you have a problem remembering that, just remember, this gives you a little tip. Think D for down. So the denominator is the down number. So if we're not using a calculator, then we want, and we're going to divide a decimal, we want to eliminate our decimal points, reduce our fractions, and reduction of numbers ending in 0. The key here in getting a correct answer is to move the decimal points the same number of places to the right in the numerator and denominator. Sometimes that requires that you add a 0. Eliminating the decimal points from a decimal fraction doesn't alter the value of the fraction nor the answer, as long as you move decimal points the same number of spaces in both the numerator and the denominator. So for example, if you are dividing 0.25 by 0.125, what do we have to do? Well, we've got 3 decimal places here. We move it 1, 2, 3, that becomes 125. We have to move it the exact same number in the numerator, and so obviously we're going to move it 1, 2, and we're going to have to add a 0 in order to make them equal and have 3 places to move it, so that becomes 250. So that's much easier to divide than the decimals. Again, here is another example. We've got 2 decimal places to move here, Since there's only one decimal place here, we add a 0, and this becomes 30 divided by 15. Also, it can make it a little bit easier if you reduce the fraction. Again, you're going to remember from grade school that that is dividing both numbers by their greatest common denominator. In other words, the number that will go into both numbers equally is going to be divided into both of those numbers. Usually the greatest common denominator is 2, 3, 4, or 5, or multiples of those numbers. If you have a really large number, sometimes you can reduce it several times by using smaller common denominators. Here's an example. We start out with 175 divided by 20. Well, we know that the greatest common denominator here is 5. 5 goes into 20 4 times. 5 goes into 175 35 times. So we have a reduced fraction here that is equal to the fraction that we started out with. Here's a little bit larger number. The greatest common denominator is a multiple of 5. It's 25. So 25 goes into 125 5 times. 25 goes into 1075 43 times, and so therefore we have reduced that fraction. We can also reduce numbers by getting rid of zeros, the same number of zeros in both the numerator and denominator. For example, I think it'll give us an example, but if we've got 10 over 100, we can get rid of a 0 in both of those, and that becomes 1/10. And here is an example of that. We've got 800 over 250, get rid of that 0 and that 0, and it becomes 80 over 25. We then can divide 5 into both of those. 25 divided by 5 is 5. 80 divided by 5 is 16 over 5, so we've reduced that. Down here, we can actually get rid of more zeros, as long as it's the same in the numerator and denominator. So we can get rid of those zeros, and those zeros, and end up with a fraction much lower and much easier to work with, which is 15 over 30. Then reduce both of, we know that 15 goes into 15 once, so we're reducing the fraction further to 1. And then 15 goes into 30 twice. So we've changed this large fraction into a smaller fraction that's easier to work with and come up with 1/2. Calculators are great as long as you enter the numbers correctly. If you enter the numbers incorrectly, you're going to have an incorrect answer. When using a calculator, your running totals should be disregarded. This can cause confusion. In other words, we're going to look at just the end product that we come up with. Your calculator will automatically add 0 when no whole number is present. If you're calculating it manually, you must add those zeros. And also, calculators will eliminate excess zeros at the end of the answer for you. Now this is going to be important. We're going to have to learn how to express to the nearest tenth or the nearest 100th. It will depend on what your dosage is. We'll talk more about that later in terms of what you reduce it to. We do have kind of a standing rule that we'll talk about, but when you express your answer to the nearest tenth, you have to carry it out to 100ths, and then you're going to round off the 10th number based on what your 100th number is. Let's see if we've got an example. Our rule of rounding is that we're going to increase the answer by 1 if the number representing hundredths is 5 or greater. If it's less than 5, then we will go down 1. So here's an example. Let me get my arrow. We've come up with the answer of 0.35. We have to round it to the nearest tenths. 5 means we're going to round up, so we drop the 5 and we increase the 3 to a 4 and come up with 0.4. This is rounding to the tenth. In this example, we've got 0.61. If you have to round it to the 10th, you see we've carried it out to the 100th. Anything less than 5, we go down or leave it the same. And so we're going to drop our 1, and this becomes 0.6, or 6/10. When we're working with smaller dosages that are, say, less than a whole number, we have to oftentimes express the answer to the nearest 100ths. This means we carry it out a little bit further. We're going to carry it out to the 1000th, then we'll round off the number representing the hundredths. So here's an example. Again, using the same rounding rule, if we're rounding to 100ths and we carry it out to the thousandths place, our 7 is greater than 5, so we're going to change this 7 to an 8, and it will become a 0.78 is our answer. Here's if we have, we've carried it out to the thousandths, our 3 is less than 5, therefore our 7 stays the same, and we drop our 3, that becomes 0.37. Again, practicing is going to be critically important. You will be doing a lot of rounding to the 10th and 100th place. You must know how to do this in order to deliver correct amounts of medication.